good afternoon, and welcome to Turning Points, Episode 6, final episode. I am Josh Rodriguez, Associate Pastor here at First Presbyterian Church, and joining me here in the FPC podcast studio today is the Reverend Dr. Stuart Gordon.
Hi, Josh.
Hey, Stuart. And joining us is our former organist, former communications worker, still active friend of the community. I don't know what else to call you, Nick.
Current email subscriber.
An editor of the American Organist.
There it is. Yes, Nick Bergen. Welcome to the podcast studio, bud.
Great fun to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a gift, and we'll get into why Nick is joining us. We're actually not talking about the organ. Maybe we'll talk about it today, but I don't think we will.
Why is it that Orthodox don't have organs in their church? No, never.
But today, for our final conversation around decisive moments in the history of Christianity, we are going to talk about schism. Now, Stuart, you have kind of set these episodes up in the way that you structured our 6-week series. So tell me, why schism? Why are we having a conversation about schism?
I remember one of the experiences through reading the Big Read, going through the Bible, were those moments when people would come to us and say, wow, I just read about that episode and really wish that weren't in the Bible.
Yeah.
Really amazed at the unfortunate stuff in the Bible, and felt that any continuation of that story needed to include the reality of church history, which continues to be just as flawed a history as the biblical history. We don't want to fall into the trap of imagining that the current church is perfect and God's people are lovely and the church is that body of perfection that God uses for his purposes in the world. I like to say that creation is beautiful and history is messy. And so it's important to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Come on.
Yeah.
Historically speaking, if you say in a church history conversation, the Great Schism, that is a specific schism to the church, correct?
There's been more than one, and I'm no expert on church history. Let's go ahead and acknowledge that now. But we are talking about the 11th century split between East and West, between Rome and Constantinople. That will be our subject today, yes. That's
right. And so that kind of leads us to why Nick is joining us, because, Nick, you're an active member of the Orthodox Church. You'll have to, I always just say the Orthodox Church. I've never even thought about what it's called.
Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church.
There we go. Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox, which is probably most well known in this community for the
baklava.
Yeah, the baklava.
I shouldn't say that.
The Orthodox. What is that? It's just the Greek Orthodox.
The festival.
The festival.
Yeah, the Greek festival.
Oh, I love that thing.
Yeah,
my kids love it a lot too. So thank you. Your church is.
We're happy to help.
Crushing the baklava game. But I always know it's happening because they always come over and gift us all the sweets because they use the parking lot, and so they gift us all that stuff. And so for that week, we're just eating good.
By all means, folks, continue that practice. We're happy to receive.
The wonderful exchange.
Yeah. There it is. Okay, so Stuart, can you give us the Reader's Digest version of when you say the Great Schism, and we can sort of go from there, but what exactly are we talking about when we talk about that split? What was going on there?
Well, let me begin with one anecdote. A colleague of mine years ago told me the story of performing a wedding with a pastor from another denomination, which had been formed out of a split from our present denomination. And that pastor said to my colleague, that split was about one thing. It was about the authority of the Bible. And my friend said, I think we both know that whenever there's a split in anything, it's about more than one thing.
Yeah.
Which is so obviously true, but which is a helpful reminder as we discuss, 1054 and the first century and the 20th century, that it's always about more than one thing. And I have read different historical sources on 1054 and hear, different versions of what went on there. One said that Cardinal Humbert didn't speak Greek at all and didn't bother to learn, and insulted his brothers in Constantinople, and another version that said he was an expert in Greek. So
there you go.
It happened a long time ago. And what exactly do we know? But different reasons offered for schism. And so really the subject today is the church in all its flaws and all its efforts to stick to the truth in grace can frequently find itself at odds. And even those who profess to be ambassadors of reconciliation can end up being, instruments of division.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of had a fun way to get into this by asking Nick the question. What was your question for Nick?
Well, if a Western Christian would ask an Eastern Christian, why was there a split between East and West, what would be the short answer?
How much time do you have? Would be the short answer.
I think we have about 40 minutes, don't we, John?
Yeah. But we're going to exhaust the conversation today, for sure.
It is complicated, I think. And my understanding has always been that it was the fruit of centuries of sort of gradual dividing. You mentioned language, and I do think that that's a critical thing. My understanding is that in the early years of the Roman world, people tended to be maybe bilingual. And so people who spoke Greek could understand Latin, and people who spoke Latin could understand Greek. And that ceased to be the case further down the road. So people in different parts of the world were speaking different languages and not communicating with one another. So I think that was a big factor. And when you're not speaking the same language, things just diverge, I think.
Yep.
I think, too, language has a lot to do with how, if I'm thinking if I was a bilingual person, I would probably think differently in one language than I do in another. And I think so maybe there's something just to the way theology develops in a given language. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that completely, Nick. And that's a point that we've discussed in earlier conversations about the development of the creeds, where the church went from being a primarily Aramaic-speaking body to a Greek reading and speaking body, and different languages conceptualize things differently. And so the development of the creeds is evidence of the impact that language has on thought.
Yeah. And I'll give you a little quote here from Noel's book, because he kind of says exactly what we're saying. He says, the Great Schism of 1054 was a major turning point in Christian history because it brought to a head centuries of East-West cultural disengagement, theological differences, and ecclesiastical suspicion. So there's just so much going into what they name in 1054. But Stuart, to your point too, when you talk to people, even now, about if we say a church split last year, and you ask them, well, why did they split? There's a few topics, but then there's also some personality involved in it.
Right.
And so it's always more complicated than just, the centrality of Scripture. It's well, it's probably more than that.
Yeah, so there's language and there's culture, and there's also the politics of it, in which you had different centers of the church. Constantinople was one, Rome was one, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. And it's hard for us to understand in retrospect, but Rome was not the center of the church for a long time. And so you had, by the 11th century, this sort of internecine conflict over supreme authority in the church. And so the Bishop of Rome was in competition with the Bishop of Constantinople.
Yeah.
Right. And the way I've always heard this explained is, so you have these sort of centers of power in the church, and 4 of them were in the eastern part of the world, and then Rome was by itself in the west. And I think, was it in the 4th century when the barbarians sacked Rome, right? And so I think one result of that was political chaos.
Yeah.
And I think that the papacy came to have a sort of political unifying function in the midst of that chaos. And so the church hierarch in that part of the world was exercising an authority that wasn't the case elsewhere. And then I also, it's my understanding that Rome did have a place sort of honor among the first, what people call it the Pentarchy, right? Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and
Constantinople.
Yeah, right. And so I guess because it was the place where Peter and Paul were martyred and where their relics were kept. And so anyway, so my understanding is another big factor was this issue of jurisdiction, basically. And the model that the Orthodox Church holds up is sort of collegiality among bishops, or sort of conciliar authority, where things are decided, questions of doctrine and so on are decided by way of council. And I guess what was emerging in Rome was a more a model where authority was really centered in the papacy and in the person of the Pope.
You know, I'm not going to ask immediately for this. I'm just going to float that we could discuss the impact of the different Trinitarian visions of East and West upon that style of leadership. I think you would probably be prepared to answer that question, but we'll hold that for later on.
I'll let my subconscious work on that.
Yeah. So, Stuart, and Nick, you probably, either anybody, but could you give a little bit of, for anybody watching, you're like, okay, so the church split, there are these differences. Could we give some, could you paint a little picture of like what are the differences that are starting to crop up that led to sort of these churches saying we're going to have to go our separate ways here, other than just naming that there was a lot going on? What seemed to be brewing in there? What were some major ingredients in the stew?
May I list a few things from my references? And some of this is a legitimate effort on the part of the Bishop of Rome to reform the church in relevant ways. I mean, one being the practice of simony. It had developed within the church that ecclesiastical privileges and preferments were being sold, and so there was a corruption of church office that had been occurring at that point, and the Pope Leo is trying to clean that up. Mm-hmm. There's the increasing problem of the loss of church properties. One thing that Protestants may not realize is that clerical celibacy was not the original policy of the church, and it was not originally grounded in the assertion that Jesus was celibate and therefore priests should be celibate. By the 11th century, there's a problem, the concern that the church is going to lose all its property because the priests have children and the property is getting divided and divided and divided. And so Pope Leo is looking for celibacy, and in the Eastern Church, the answer to that was, are you kidding me?
That's still the answer.
It's still the answer. Your priest at the Greek Orthodox Church is married, I guess.
That's correct.
Okay. So two of those things. I won't try to list them all, but two things. So very real concern about issues of import, which are simony, the selling of ecclesiastical preferments.
Like
and
when you
celibacy.
say that, when you say the selling of ecclesiastical preferments, give me.
Well, there's a position open at the church down the road, and if you give me enough money, you can be the priest there.
There we go.
Yeah.
And there's power obviously associated with that sort of thing too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Nick, is there anything else you would add to just, and maybe even, it's kind of fun. I mean, I've gone and visited an Orthodox church. It was like part of my undergrad experience that we went and visited an Orthodox church, and we got to see the sanctuary, and they sort of showed us the icons and the iconoclast, or kind of
iconostasis.
Yeah, the wall, and the Orthodox priest was in like full garb.
Yeah,
and as a kid who I didn't have any concept of an Orthodox church, the only church I'd ever been to were these little fundy churches in nowhere, Indiana. And so then to show up to an Orthodox church and be like, what is happening here? I was kind of mesmerized by it all. But could you just kind of speak to some of just maybe the personality of,
and especially icons? That's an issue.
Yeah.
I think there's some just cultural difference. One thing that just pops into my head is I know that there was a disagreement over whether they should use leavened or unleavened bread for the Eucharist.
Oh, my word!
That's right.
You are using unleavened bread, you heretic!
So that was one thing. I think, too, there's, I would say that this is still kind of a feature of Orthodox Christianity today that is attractive to certain kind of person. It's attractive to me. I'd say that there tends to be, you see this maybe less, if I can use the term, anthropological pessimism. I think
It's a polite way to put it.
Yeah, you kind of see that, and there's, Orthodox Christianity tends to be much less centered, like, we don't pay as much attention to St. Augustine, basically.
Okay.
He is a saint in the Orthodox Church, but he's a Latin-speaking church father, and so there's kind of, so culturally, and I don't know, Augustine was no optimist about human nature,
Yeah.
And which is not to say that we don't have a sense of original sin or of humanity being fallen, but it's I guess we see it as a less.
It's a minor theme, not a major theme.
Yeah, and it was sort of sometimes you'll hear people say, like, when Adam fell, it was like a child falling or something like that, so there was this human nature that stood to be perfected, and it kind of went off course,
Yeah.
It wasn't something that was in perfect form and then fell from greatness. So there's kind of, I don't know, it's hard to articulate that, but I guess, so culturally speaking, to answer your question, there tends to be more optimism about what humans are capable of. Mm-hmm. Certainly acknowledging a strong dependence on God. It's like so there's this idea of cooperation with God as a way of pursuing salvation, I guess.
Yeah.
And so we bring a very small piece of the puzzle to that equation, but we're sort of offering the widow's mite or something like that. So anyway, I think even in the early sort of in the first millennium, that divergence is becoming evident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, speaking to the current day, that particular perspective is enormously appealing to lots of folks. I've just read books, or Anne has read books recently that mention that very point, that for a lot of folks who do not appreciate Augustinian, Reformed Christianity, who feel as if they've been beaten over the heads with their sinfulness, it's very appealing. And maybe they're not even aware that there's this whole wing of the church for which that is the case. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned about along the way is the way that the Orthodox Church does theology. And I'm trying to remember the phrase right now. I think I've asked you about it before.
Apophatic theology.
There it is, apophatic theology. And so they are more prone to speak about what God is not, and as I'm over-characterizing certainly, but less prone to talk about like the certainty of this is exactly what God is, and more prone to talk about, well, this is what we know God is not. Mm-hmm. And I've always kind of been drawn to that, and I've always thought that is a fascinating way to do theology. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I've told Adam before, especially in youth ministry, it always seems like there's some of these like primary things that crop up amongst young people of like, well, this must be true about God. And I was like, Adam, we just need a liturgy of what God is not. and we just need to say it all the time so the kids can kind of stop holding on to these lies that they graduate with. But
not moralistic, therapeutic, deist.
yeah. Just trying to do something. But I remember thinking, I think some just solid apophatic theology could be helpful.
And I think too, like, There's again, this is kind of maybe an overgeneralization, but it's funny because I just talked about the sort of within the Orthodox world, there's maybe less pessimism about human nature, but I think there is a great deal of pessimism sort of in the Orthodox mindset about our capacity for reason. So we think about the fall really adversely affecting our reason and our understanding. And so because of that, I think that's where that mistrust of sort of doing theology as in a kind of a rationalistic way.
Yeah.
Which I think, so there's no like Summa Theologica in the Orthodox Church, you know, or there's no Karl Barth which is not to say that there's no serious theology that's happening, but it just comes from a different place. And there's more of an emphasis on sort of experiencing the liturgical life of the church and coming at God from the place of worship, I guess.
Yeah, which it's easy to forget the creeds that we have. The Nicene Creed really is an Eastern creed. Mm-hmm. The development of that creed, which remains orthodoxy, right praise for the whole church, really is an Eastern creed. It was written in Greek. It was utilizing Greek concepts. And it's unfortunate that division happened, that filioque clause, which apparently just sort of sneaked its way into the creed after it's embraced by council of the church. And the Eastern churches became concerned that somewhere along the line, the Western churches inserted that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son.
Right.
But so it's important to remember that the theological heritage that even the Western church has is enormously Eastern in ways. Yeah.
So, and so we do have to talk about the filioque, right? Because that's sort of probably the main sticking point, that and the papacy, right? So what I've read this in a couple of places, was that the filioque clause, which is that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, was inserted into the creed in Spain as a way of sort of safeguarding against Arianism. In other words, as a way of really asserting the divinity of Christ. And at some point, that became like the way to say the creed in the West. And this was not recognized in the East, and I guess it became the sticking point was at some point Rome began to say, "You're saying the creed wrong." And, them's fighting words. So yeah,
which even as you say it that way, if this is hard to conceptualize, thinking now when you hear the Lord's Prayer said when there's several denominations, you'll hear some people say debts and you'll hear trespasses in there as well. And I have heard people sort of take other people to town over what it's supposed to be. And I'm sort of like, this is so, but just to conceptualize what you're kind of saying there.
One of those lovely words that we learn in church history that are helpful, it's another Greek word, is adiaphora, which is matters of indifference. John Calvin liked to talk about that. The church has to figure out, just like everybody else does, what is really worth fighting over and what isn't worth fighting over. And I can remember going to a Sunday school class when I was a young adult before I was married, taught by a marriage counselor who was giving this lesson. You have to decide what's really worth fighting for and what isn't, like how the dishwasher is loaded. Maybe that really matters to you enough that you're going to fight about that, but you have to decide what's worth fighting over and what isn't worth fighting over. And fighting over whether the communion bread is leavened or unleavened, somebody decided that was essential. That was an essential tenet to fight over. The filioque clause, another one, ended up being an essential matter. When we look back on our church splits through the years, sometimes we have to wince at things that we thought were essential that in retrospect don't seem to have been so essential.
Yeah, well, and Ryan made such a good point in the sermon this week about this when he was looking at Paul and Barnabas as whether or not to bring Mark. And then he the way that he dates the New Testament text is to say, at one point, Paul was certain that Mark should not be joining them in their travels. And then both of them seem to be in a cell together in Rome later on in the ministry. So you almost wonder if Paul could go back and look at his own disagreement with Barnabas, how he would wince at his own,
Right.
or not, right? How maybe Barnabas would have winced, or whomever. I'm not taking sides there, but
And as a little digression, fun to look at the difference between the way Luke describes the reasons for the split in the book of Acts and how Paul describes the split or some cause of conflict between himself and Barnabas. Luke describes it in that way that Mark bailed out on them on the missionary journey, and Paul didn't trust him, and Barnabas wanted Mark to go with them, and so Paul and Barnabas split over this, and Barnabas took John Mark, and Paul took Silas, and they went their separate ways. The way Paul describes in Galatians his anger with Barnabas was over Barnabas withdrawing from table fellowship with Gentile Christians. And he said Peter did it when James's people came from Jerusalem up to Antioch. The Jews who were formerly eating with Gentiles got scared, and so they withdrew from table fellowship. And Paul is furious. Paul tells in pretty vivid language that he got in Peter's face and said, if you, a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you expect the Gentiles to live like Jews?
Yeah.
And that is what he said, even Barnabas was led astray by that, and he withdrew from table fellowship.
Yeah. Now you got me. That's a different sermon.
That's a different sermon. Like I said, that's a digression. But interesting that the reasons for division, somebody's going to say, well, the reason why we split was over the authority of the Bible. And somebody else is going to say, there's a lot of other stuff involved with that. People have their different perspectives on what was the cause for the split.
Yeah. And so let's not fast forward, but let's move a little bit, because there's this faith community has plenty of its own schism to talk about. I would be curious, Stuart, if you could give some language as to how, because I think you taught about this in Sunday school. Mm-hmm. Could you give some language a little bit to maybe modern schisms in the church and how we navigate these? And I mean, we've kind of hinted at it already, but
I first became aware of this on my first date with my wife, Ann, when I went to pick her up at her apartment in Richmond. And she was still getting ready, so I sat in the living room and I looked on her bookshelf in her living room, and she had a book, The Documentary History of the First Presbyterian Church of Nashville. And I'm a single young minister, and I look at that and I go, what a woman. Holy cow, she's got her church history on the bookshelf. So I sit down and I'm leafing through this book as she's getting ready. And by the time she comes out, I've noticed, holy cow, that church had a split in practically every decade of the 20th century. What on earth? And it really got the nickname the Fightin' First. Yeah. They got coverage in the local newspapers, in the Tennessean and the Nashville Banner. And it's a lot of, you can understand why there are splits, but it's tragic. But it's a little reminder. So the first one that we sometimes talk about in officer training is in the 1940s, the early 1940s. Following a very successful pastorate with James I. Vance. He was succeeded as pastor by James Barr, who was one of the assistant ministers. Mm-hmm. And the way the story is told is that it was a pacifism sermon that James Barr offered in the beginnings of World War II, that alienated a substantial portion of the congregation. And you can hear stories about it. But the end result, whether it was the sermon or whether it was other aspects of his leadership, was the presbytery actually formed a new Presbyterian church in Nashville, Trinity Presbyterian Church, which is on Hillsborough Road, which is south of 440, with about 300 members of First Pres who left to form another Presbyterian church out of First Presbyterian. Which actually amazing when you think, can you fathom a presbytery these days blessing another Presbyterian congregation just down the road from the one they're splitting from? But there it was with a congregational split over, it's probably about more than one thing, right? It's about leadership and about, the presenting issue and other things.
Yeah. And I always think about there's so much misinformation that ends up happening in the process of schism. Like when people do start to split and you start, I was leading worship one time with a woman that was a part of a church and she was going to formally join, and she was asking me about some of the doctrine and some of the phrases. And I just remember thinking there's so much misinformation. It's been so one-sided that you really don't have a full picture of this. Mm-hmm. And to circle back to icons, my sense is most Protestants, I remember when I was in the Orthodox Church when we were visiting, I remember thinking the way they are talking about these is not how I have heard Protestants. I guess Protestant is the right. This is not how Protestants have really classified this for me. And I feel like I've been a little misled as to what's going on and to what is actually understood with the use of icons in the worship service or the community. Could you give us a little Nick Bergen's take on the icons?
Yeah.
Can I acknowledge we're taxing you on a lot of
We're not
representation.
taxing Nick Bergen. Nick Bergen is brilliant, and he has studied orthodoxy for a long time. He's prepared for this.
Okay, all right.
That's very kind. Okay. So the iconography in the church is one of my favorite things about being Orthodox. And, it's a very kind of stylized kind of art. Everything's two-dimensional, and it's very symbolic. But basically, the fight over icons happened. Do you remember?
Well, it's actually mentioned here in the 11th century where the West, the Pope Leo is concerned about iconography, and it sounds as if it's the Protestant era. Mm-hmm. You have iconoclastic groups that are seeking to eliminate the practice of, I don't know how, using icons as devotional aids. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like the 16th century when Protestants came in and were smashing windows and smashing statues.
So I mean, the kind of classic text on this in the Orthodox Church is by St. John of Damascus, and it's in like the 6th or 7th or 8th century, somewhere in like something like that. And it's, I forget, but it's like 3 sermons on the divine images or something like that. But basically, what he says is because God became incarnate as a human, he sanctified the creation, what was fallen. And he sanctified human nature by becoming incarnate. I'm really probably going to mess this up. So
You're doing well so far.
I'm giving it the old college try. Yeah. So because of that, because God became visible in the form of Christ, it is acceptable to create images of God because he became, flesh. So, and so we do paint images of Jesus Christ and of the Virgin Mary and of canonized saints. And the idea, and there is a devotional practice which might make a Protestant cringe, but so you'll like go and reverence an icon. So you'll make the sign of the cross, and you'll go and bow before, say, the icon of Christ, and you'll like kiss his hand. And so the goal here is not to worship wood and paint, right? Yeah. But the idea is that the reverence that we are giving to the icon is actually passing through the icon to the thing that it's representing, right? Yeah. So it's just a way of honoring Christ or honoring the Virgin Mary or honoring, and I don't know, that probably raises some hackles, but that's kind of it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and my big thing is when I saw it, you can talk about this till you're blue in the face, but when you see someone entering into that devotional practice, I remember that being the thing that gave me pause, because I thought, this is not the picture that had been painted of, well, I'm too on the nose there, but this is a different picture than what I understood.
Yeah, right.
And I remember just thinking, this deserves more thought than what I've kind of been encouraged to.
And so you can see where Protestants would have a problem with this, right? And they're thinking in terms of the first commandment, that you shall not make for yourself an image. And Nick's just beautifully sort of summarized the theological defense that what has happened since the first commandment was the incarnation. And so it's a reasonable case to make, okay? There's a reason why that Protestants still don't bless icons, but it's not unreasonable, the case that is made, that given the incarnation, that material matter is blessed, and it can, in some sense, represent the second person of the Trinity. And
I think it's important to say, too, that I think the kind of iconography that Protestantism was uncomfortable with is, frankly, a lot of Orthodox people would be uncomfortable with, because it's, early Renaissance, sort of late medieval Western art, which is a very different thing than the sort of very kind of stylized and kind of canonical style of that Byzantine iconography is. So, and
that's pretty. I mean, you see Orthodox iconography, and you realize one would not mistake this as an attempt to realistically portray the human body.
Right. Yep.
This is clearly flat. It clearly has its own style, and it's intended to be a window through the presence of Christ rather than the thing itself.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think one could make the case, not that as an Augustinian Calvinist I'm going to do this, but I don't know if one would call it sacramental, but the idea of the sacraments is that they are a visible sign and seal of an invisible reality. Mm-hmm. And iconography, I think, seems to function in that way. Mm-hmm. It's not. I'm not trying to say that this little thing is really Jesus' pinky, but that it is a visible sign and seal of his presence to me by faith.
Yeah.
And I think one could reasonably make the argument that that's what's going on with iconography and their devotional use, is that they are, in some sense, sacramental.
Yeah, definitely.
There it is. Man, you converting us right now, Nick. We might.
Well, and
you're helping them, Stuart.
Important to remember, we are still part of the one holy Catholic Church.
Yeah. Regardless
of the schism, we share the Nicene Creed. We share the same convictions. We're one in the Lord's Supper, and that is one of the gifts of the passage of time, is that we acknowledge the things that split us, but we also acknowledge that because of the Lord Jesus Christ and his faithfulness, we remain members of one body. I mean, we do the same as Protestants and Catholics. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since the Protestant Reformation, and even though some of those horrible Reformation-era anathemas sit there in our confessions, we, in the 90s, Catholics and Lutherans adopted a joint statement on justification, which would have seemed impossible up until like 1970, perhaps. And so it's important to remember there were splits, but we don't have to remain in a hot sort of animosity toward one another from the past.
I think, if I can push back on that a little bit.
Oh, please do. That'll make it more interesting.
I think that there's because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I think it is helpful to remember that there is a reality that, like, I can't, like, as a practicing member of the Orthodox Church, I can't actually come to First Pres and receive communion canonically.
You're not allowed by your church.
Right. And the same would be true if you turned up across the street. Mm-hmm. So there's a really helpful, and so when I first was encountering Orthodox Christianity and thinking about becoming Orthodox, this was very painful to me, because it was like, because I was working here at the time. It's like, this is really complicated, and there's so time does heal a lot of wounds, but there also there's some painful division that is still reality, And there's a phrase that the 20th century Orthodox theologian George Florovsky, who was very active with the World Council of Churches in the mid-century, used. And he talked about the idea of divided brethren. And he said the emphasis is equal on both words. So there's real division there, but at the same time, there's real brotherhood there. Mm-hmm. And I think that... in some cases, some of these, doctrinal questions are not unimportant, I guess, but I guess those conversations always need to be grounded in a place of love and a place of sort of this joint understanding that there is a real brotherhood in Christ here. So I don't know.
Oh, thank you for saying that, and thank you for reminding us from the Orthodox side. I'm an Enneagram 9, Josh, and so I'm a peacemaker, and I'm always ready to declare, we can all get along well.
We're all good. We've made it. We've arrived.
Yeah,
we have it. When I was at the Orthodox Church, and they were explaining the iconostasis, the wall, and they're like, this represents the presence. I said, a wall represents... But, my little... I was in a Wesleyan church, so my Wesleyan imagination was staring at that priest, doing my best to show a certain amount of reverence as I was like, I don't think so, bud. I'm not with you here. But there are big differences.
Yeah.
That still keep, in seminary, I took a class on communion, and Dr. George Hunsinger walked through and people in the class, which not growing up in the church, this was not much of a thing for me. But one of the things that people started to share is when they had been turned away from the communion table at a Catholic church or a Catholic wedding was kind of their stories. But those are painful moments.
It's
for people.
painful. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
This is, Rachel and I are converts to Orthodox Christianity, but our parents are not, So like when we go home for Christmas, it's like, or when my mom comes to town or whatever, there's this sort of awkwardness about communion, which is, so it's kind of, it's a problem, and it's kind of it's a scandal in a way. And so there's still work to be done there, but it has to be grounded in a place of mutual respect
which is, I think, kind of as we start to wrap the conversation up, we're already getting there. This is helpful to think, okay, there's obviously plenty of examples of schism in the church that still have very painful manifestations. Yeah. And yet we're still, the body of Christ, moving forward, trying to navigate, okay, how do we do this moving forward? Because best I can tell, in the next 1,000 years, there will still be schisms to write about. Right? Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if there wouldn't be a word, which you're kind of already offering, but what would be the word of encouragement to someone listening to say, okay, you're approaching a potential schism in some sort of body. Could you even imagine in modern day America approaching a schism, but what would be the encouragement of what's the posture? What's the faithful presence of one still trying to faithfully follow Jesus in this world to approach those moments?
I've witnessed this, and I think it's important to know your own barometer. Mm-hmm. Some people, I think, are predisposed to distinction, mm-hmm. and will cite the Bible passage that justifies division. Yep. Jesus said, "I've come to bring not peace but a sword," and are just predisposed to, by golly, you need to draw a line, and, mm-hmm. and this is it. And others are like me, and we're going to quote Jesus, praying that they may all be one, just like, you and I are one. And I think that's, in any experience of the church, the individual Christians need to have a sense of their own emotional comfort level with division, mm-hmm. and not be driven simply by their own personality. Yeah.
And personality got brought up, but when you think about some of the splits and you think about some of the people who have left, and you think a lot of times when there's someone saying this is the faithful, righteous thing that we should be doing, what goes along with that sometimes is this very intense personality that wants to be right, or that wants to be, and you're like, there's plenty of people that might agree with you, but because of the way that you embody your position, it's like that's what's splitting the church as much as anything else. So, which it's not hard to find examples of that throughout history,
right? But and to be aware, I'm acutely aware, having served this congregation for 16 years, acutely aware of its history of splits.
Yep.
And acutely aware, because of the testimony of members, how painful those splits are.
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned the one from the 50s where the church went through a 10-year process of deciding that it needed to move from its downtown location to this location in Oak Hill. A new congregation was formed out of that, constituted of folks who felt that the mission was downtown Nashville and it was important to remain there. So a new church was formed. The property was sold by the session to the new congregation, and people haven't forgotten that yet. There's still people in both churches who remember that and remember how painful it was, and are still angry about that.
Yep.
We have a split from 40 years ago in which a pastor left over sincere disagreement with the denomination of which we're a part, and just felt like in good conscience he couldn't remain in it. And lots of people went with the pastor, and lots of people stayed. And there's plenty of families in this church who still remember that. And so, yeah, it's painful. It hurts. And you want to be mindful. I'm mindful of that as a pastor of this church, appreciating that we've enjoyed many years of peace and many years of healthy, fruitful ministry. But you just never want to take the peace of the church for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, would you add anything to the conversation from the other side of Tyne, of how you might approach a potential schism?
Golly, no, I can't think of anything. I think Stuart said it very well.
Yeah.
I think that it's really helpful to, I think that, I think it says a lot that I worked as the organist here for 7 years. The last year I was the organist here, I was like a member of the Orthodox Church. That was complicated, but it was okay.
Yeah.
And then I came back here, a year and a half later to just work for the church. Mm-hmm. And I think that so I guess maybe one answer is things are going to be rooted in actual human relationships, and it's so much easier to talk. We're having a reasonably civil conversation about this, and it's really easy to do that because, I've known both of you for years, and have, respect and love for both of you. So I think maybe that's one solution, is just having it be grounded in real friendships and real relationships.
Yeah. Well, and you said the phrase you used earlier that I appreciate, like the mutual respect. I think and Stuart, you're really good at this too. When you're trying to have a conversation with someone where you seem to be in disagreement, you always encourage, like, can you articulate the other person's argument well? But also this sense of like, if you don't really have a sense of respect, the sort of divisions that can crop up in communities, it's just endless.
Yeah.
And it's already hard enough to try to faithfully follow Jesus in this world, let alone when the people that you're trying to follow him with you don't have much love or respect for.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes to mind as I'm saying this is, we have so much to gain from having these conversations. I mentioned the sort of orthodox mistrust of Augustine, but there's a guy, he died a few years ago, Father Matthew Baker, who was a convert to Orthodoxy and a really good scholar, and he was really conversant with Western theology in a way that's very unusual in the Orthodox Church. I will say from experience, a lot of Orthodox apologetics are very polemical, and they're very into like drawing the sharp distinctions. And at first, maybe that's helpful to sort of help you understand, okay, this is what the Orthodox Church is. But, at some point, those things become counterproductive. And so there's a book of his that was released late last year, and he talks extensively about like reading Karl Barth, or about how this guy Florovsky that I mentioned said that the main person that the Orthodox need to recover in theological conversations is St. Augustine. Wow. And I think conversely, just on thinking theologically, Western Christianity, I mean, there's such a great treasury of Greek patristic literature, like St. John Chrysostom, St. John of Damascus, St. Athanasius, all of these, that's the common heritage of all Christians, and, so there's a lot to be gained from kind of integrating those two worlds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Nick, thank you so much for being.
This was so fun.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to show up and have this conversation with us, Stuart. Thank you for all the ways you've participated in these conversations. It has been such a gift today, but overall, it's just been a gift to be able to sit down and think about where we've come from and maybe wonder about where we're headed. So. Thank y'all very much.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you, Josh.
And everyone listening, thank you to this limited podcast series, Turning Points. Please stay tuned. There will be more to come, and you'll hear about it from our communications director, Mrs. Rachel Davis. So thank you all. God bless. Grace and peace.